Hers. Jessica made ends meet. It might not sound like a big accomplishment, but to her it meant that she was doing something right, because she had spent more money than she should have on renovations and opened up her own little bed and breakfast right before the beginning of a recession. It was December of 2008, and people were suffering. Times were hard, and yet she managed to keep the lights on, so she couldn't complain. The road to this point in her life had been a long and sometimes painful one. The property where she now made her living was the place she had once lived. Her parents bought the old ranch when she was in high school as a place for them to retire and relax. They wanted to raise some animals and plant a big garden. Her parents were not the types of people who knew how to do such things, but they dreamed of living in the country and waking up to a beautiful mountain view each morning. That much they could do. Her father had made a good deal of money in the 1970s, despite being in the middle of another economic spiral, which allowed her parents to take their time and find the perfect spot to retire. It was a larger house than they would ever need, but it was too beautiful for them to pass up. Despite its size, it had the feeling of a small country home with a big front porch. It was blue with white trim. In the spring, when everything was in bloom, the house was enveloped by trees and flowers, and it had a small brook running through the front yard. It looked like a picture you'd find on a jigsaw puzzle. In the winter, the old stone wall on the edge of the property was what stood out the most to Jessica. She imagined it being from the 1700s and belonging to a family of revolutionaries. Now it was falling apart in several places, but when it was covered in snow, it was beautiful. There were 2 large barns on the property, and 40 acres of fruit trees, maple trees, hills, streams, and enough scenery to fill 1,000 postcard racks at the airport. It was her parents' dream home, and they loved it there. By 2004, both of her parents were gone, and the house presented Jessica with a dilemma. She could sell the place, pocket the money, and move on with her life, or she could try to hold on to it. Being a school teacher without a massive income, Jessica wasn't sure how she could hold on to the property. She didn't think that she'd be able to afford the taxes on the place, much less the cost of maintaining it. It was too big for her to live in by herself. It was too far away from any big cities. It was in need of repairs and renovations if she were going to make the place her own. She loved her mother, but not the woman's taste in wallpaper. There were 1,000 reasons why Jessica should have sold the ranch and moved on, but she could never bring herself to do it. So she moved in, and she tried her best to change the place just enough so that she wouldn't expect to find her father sipping coffee at the kitchen table each morning, or her mother sitting on the porch swing out front. At this point in her life, Jessica had been a teacher. She worked with 3rd graders every day, and she had gotten used to a certain amount of chaos in her life. Moving meant that she had to quit that job. Living on her parents' land meant that her life was quiet. Too quiet. She lived in a house that was far too big for her, on land that was far away from her nearest neighbor and a 30-minute walk to the nearest shop. She loved it, and she needed it, but she also needed more. She needed something to do besides pulling up carpet and painting walls. Her best friend in town was the man who ran the local hardware store, and that was just depressing. That's when she first thought of turning the house into a bed and breakfast. It was an idea that she didn't leap at right away, but it lingered in her mind over time. She started to ask herself why she wouldn't do such a thing. Then she began planning. She worked on her business model, not for any loans or investors, but to prove to herself that she knew what she was getting into. Time went on, and she made that idea into her reality. The job wasn't what she had always dreamed of doing, but she enjoyed it. It was just enough human interaction to keep her sane, while being isolated enough to keep her mind at ease. When she thought of the bed and breakfast, she imagined the place being packed over the holidays. She imagined sitting in her quiet little corner of the house while families opened presents on Christmas morning, kids getting new dolls and bikes, adults drinking eggnog and singing carols in front of a fire pit out front. She imagined it being like the Christmases that she'd had when she was younger with her parents, and she thought that it would be nice to observe those celebrations, even from a respectful distance, because her parents were gone now. She didn't have any siblings. All of her friends had families of their own. Things didn't turn out quite the way she imagined. In fact, the bed and breakfast wasn't even the part of her business which brought in the most money. When she opened the place, she wanted to diversify her business as much as possible. So she turned one of the barns into a party hall, which hosted everything from high school proms to wedding receptions. She opened the rest of the property up to weddings, as well as seasonal celebrations, hay rides, and haunted houses in the fall, a Christmas light spectacular, which ran from December 1st through December 23rd, farmers markets, flower festivals, 4th of July fireworks displays. None of these things made her rich by any means, but she was making a profit, and that meant that she was doing something right. She was proud of what she had accomplished in such a short time. But after the festivals died down around Christmas, people went home to spend time with their families. The bed and breakfast was more empty than she thought it would be. As Jessica sat in front of the fire that Christmas Eve, snow was coming down hard outside. She had her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, and her only companion was her Belgian Malinois, Keaton. The house was so quiet that she could hear the tiny motor working inside of one of the more modern ornaments on her tree, which had Santa's sleigh flying in circles over a house. She was sitting on the floor, with Keaton snuggled up at her side. Both of them were watching the fire burn. The way the flames moved around each other, rising up and blinking out, was like a dance, she thought. It was hypnotic, and every random pop and crackle that came from the wood only served to pull her deeper into that trance. Memories of Christmases past floated in and out of her mind. Embarrassing school productions, the first Christmas she'd spent with her parents in their new giant house. She remembered opening presents in the morning before driving to her grandparents' house for the big family gathering. She remembered building a snowman in the front yard of her old house. In her mind, she was trying to pretend that Christmas Day would still be something special, a day full of old movies and phone calls with her aunt and her cousins, maybe a walk across the property with Keaton, which would be beautiful in the snow. Maybe she'd take some pictures of the old stone wall. She told herself that it would be a nice Christmas, but the reality of it was, the day would be no different than any other day for her. She had nobody to exchange presents or play games with, nobody to laugh with as they burned the sugar cookies and then covered up the damage with too much icing. She didn't even have real eggnog in the house, because she'd stopped drinking after making the old 5 o'clock somewhere joke to herself far too many times. Jessica had led a great life. She'd traveled and she'd been in love a few times. She had never seen marriage as something that she needed in her life, and she'd never found anyone who made her want to settle down, so she didn't regret ending any of those relationships. That said, she was a 40-something-year-old woman, quickly approaching the half-century mark, and she'd be lying if she said that there wasn't some small part of her that wished that she had more people to share her life with. Really share her life. She was too proud of her status as a strong, independent woman of the 21st century to say that she needed a man. It just would have been nice to have someone. As if he sensed her thoughts and wanted to comfort her, Keaton lifted his head and rested his chin on Jessica's leg. He looked up at her with big, loving brown eyes and let out a sigh. "I love you too, buddy," she told him, rubbing the big dog's ear. Then his head shot up once again. His ears stood at full alert and a low growl rumbled through his entire body. There were times when Jessica forgot that Keaton was a large, intimidating dog, capable of defending her house if it ever came to that. Most of the time, she just saw him as her adorable cuddle buddy. This was not one of those times. As soon as Keaton turned toward the window at full alert, Jessica turned to take a look for herself. She saw nothing but blackness through them. Next, there was a knock on her door. The moment was like 100 scenes from 100 slasher movies that she'd seen in her life, and while Jessica may have been great at screaming at the TV and telling fictional characters what to do in moments such as these, she didn't even move when it happened to her. "Hello?" came the voice of a man outside. "Are you open?" It occurred to Jessica that she was, in fact, sitting inside of a business, a place where people could show up at any time looking for a place to sleep. The thought didn't occur to Keaton. As soon as he heard the voice, the dog ran to the front door, barking like a monster. Jessica put down her mug on a nearby table and rose to her feet, just as she saw the man walk over to one of the front windows and look inside. When he saw her, the man smiled and said, "Oh, thank God. I thought I'd be stranded out here all night." He wasn't holding a knife. That was a good sign. Jessica gestured for the man to meet her at the front door, and she went to unlock it for him. "Keaton, be cool," she said in a quiet tone. Loud enough to give the dog his stand-down command, but not loud enough for the man outside to hear that command. The dog stopped barking, turned, took a few steps away from the door, then turned to face it once again. Good boy, Jessica told him. She then unlocked the front door and opened it, letting the man come inside as snow blew in around him. It was coming down hard now. Inches had accumulated since she'd last seen her front lawn. "He must be freezing," she said as the man brushed himself off and took a deep breath of the warm air. He was young, in his 20s perhaps. He was thin, with dark, shaggy hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He had a backpack slung over his shoulder. He smiled politely at Jessica as he rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them up. "I don't have a reservation," he said. "Please tell me that you have a room available." Jessica smiled and said, "I do. You and Deputy Linden will be my only guests this Christmas Eve, and he's already upstairs." She watched the man's face carefully as she told him the lie about having a deputy upstairs. He didn't react much at all, which she supposed was a good thing. "I'm Jared," the man said. "I got stranded on the road about a mile from here. I don't think I'll be making it out anytime soon." He extended a hand, which she shook as she said, "I'm Jessica, owner of this lovely establishment." "Savior of stranded travelers," Jared joked. Jessica shrugged and said, "Only sometimes. Let's get you checked in." She guided Jared over to the desk that she'd set up in the foyer, while Keaton walked behind them, keeping a careful eye on the stranger. "Do you have family in town?" she asked, turning on her computer. "No, I'm working through the holiday. They're all back home." "Far away?" Jared nodded and shrugged at the same time and said, "Very." Jessica pulled up her guest registration and asked, "Last name?" "Fuller," Jared told her. "Nice to meet you, Jared Fuller. How long will you be staying with us?" Jared glanced back toward the door and said, "Just the night, I hope." "It can take some time for the roads to get plowed around here," Jessica told him. "And with tomorrow being Christmas, it could take even longer. I'll put you down for the night, and we'll see how it goes." "That's fine," Jared agreed. "Credit?" Jessica asked him. "Yes," Jared replied, reaching for his wallet. He checked his back pocket first and then felt his coat pocket. Then he started looking through his bag. "I have my card here somewhere, I swear." Jessica smiled and said, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." As he searched through his bag, Jessica could see notebooks and papers and what looked like a TV remote, but Jared had no clothing packed in there. She also didn't spot any duct tape, knives, or a gun, which was reassuring. He finally found his wallet and pulled it out of the bottom of his bag. After he handed her his credit card and she began to process his payment, she said, "You missed most of the Christmas festivities around here, but if you're stuck here tomorrow, I'll cook up a nice breakfast and we'll try to make the best of it." Jared smiled and said, "As long as the heat stays on, I'll be happy." Jessica glanced back to the computer screen where she was attempting to process his credit card, but the system was slow and the payment hadn't gone through yet. She turned back to Jared and asked, "You said that you're working in the area?" Jared nodded and said, "Well, the work itself kind of travels with me." "What do you do, if you don't mind my asking?" "I'm a student down at the university. I'm working on my thesis." "That's cool," Jessica nodded. "What about?" Jared bobbed his head as though trying to think of some way of summing up his work before he said, "Philosophy, I guess. It's sort of complicated." With a smile, Jessica said, "All the best theses are." Jared chuckled at that. Jessica turned back to her computer, but the payment still hadn't gone through. Instead, an error message appeared telling her that her computer was having difficulty connecting to the credit processing servers and to try again at a later time. She took a deep breath and held out Jared's credit card as she told him, "Looks like my internet is acting up. Mind if we try this again tomorrow?" Jared took his card back from her and replied, "I'm not going anywhere." Jessica grabbed a key from a nearby rack and handed it to Jared as she said, "You're in number 3. Turn left at the top of the stairs, 2 doors down on the left." Jared nodded and took the key from her. "Mind if I warm up by the fire before I go upstairs? I haven't felt my toes in about an hour." "Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. Can I get you something warm to drink? I have hot chocolate, coffee," Jessica offered. "Coffee would be great. I don't suppose you have anything with pumpkin spice?" Jared asked. "I think I have some syrup in the cabinet," she told him as she started to walk toward the kitchen. "You go warm up and I'll bring you a cup. I have one of those Tassimo coffee makers and it makes a pretty good latte." As Jessica entered the kitchen and started to brew Jared's drink, she could hear the sound of Keaton's paws on the hardwood floor, following Jared into the living room, where the fire was still burning. She took note of this, because there were still little voices in her head telling her that it was a bad idea to isolate herself with this stranger in the middle of a snowstorm. He wasn't sneaking up behind her, though. She knew that, because her guardian angel was keeping track of their guest. If Jared so much as took a step toward Jessica too quickly, Keaton would be on top of him in a heartbeat. As she worked, she began to think Jared was probably hungry as well, so she made up a plate of Christmas cookies and brought them with her when she brought Jared his drink. When she walked into the living room, she found Jared sitting on the hearth by the fire, with Keaton lying in front of him. To look at the dog, you'd never know that he was on guard. Jessica handed Jared his pumpkin spice latte and placed the cookies on a table beside him. "Thank you," he smiled, taking a sip. As he swallowed the drink, Jared winced as though the taste of it were causing him physical pain. "Is it bad? Do you want something else?" Jessica asked. Jared held up a hand and took another sip, wincing once again as he swallowed. Then he said, "Pumpkin spice is disgusting, but I keep asking for it. I don't even know why." Smiling, Jessica said, "Following the trend?" "I think it's just habit at this point. It's good though, all things considered. Thanks." Jessica nodded and took a seat on the couch. She was trying to think of something that a proper host would say in this moment, but she couldn't think of anything, so she wound up sitting there in silence. Eventually, Jared took a cookie and said, "You must go through a ton of these." With a nod, Jessica said, "I do. Mostly when kids come to see the Christmas lights out in the field. You just missed our big Christmas spectacular. It's a beautiful area, even without lights. I saw a deer as I was walking in." He grabbed 2 more cookies from the plate and took another painful sip of his latte. "I'm sorry," Jessica said. "I should have offered you some actual food. I don't have a proper Christmas Eve meal prepared, but I'm pretty sure that I could put together a sandwich or something if you want." Jared waved off the offer and said, "I had a burger at Thanksgiving." Jessica smiled and told him, "I don't mind cooking." "Really, I'm okay," Jared assured her. "Besides, I need as much caffeine and sugar as I can get right now." "Right, you said that you're working on your thesis." Jared nodded. Trying to keep the conversation going, Jessica kept on this track, asking, "You said that you're studying philosophy." "Sort of, yeah," Jared nodded. It's complicated." "How so?" Jessica asked. "Most people get bored pretty quickly when I start talking about it." "Try me. I used to be a teacher, so maybe I can offer some useful insight." "Okay," Jared said. He put down his mug and brushed some crumbs off of his pants as he straightened up and looked around the room, trying to find the right way to approach the subject of his thesis. "Well," he said after a few moments, "it's sort of a temporal philosophy." "Is this a Star Trek thing?" Jessica asked. Jared grinned and said, "It's not, but you're not too far off. I'm taking a look at time and timelines and the decisions that people make." Jessica tried her best to understand what Jared was telling her, but though the general concept seemed clear enough, she wasn't sure that she understood the specifics. She narrowed her eyes and shook her head, letting him know that she didn't quite get it. Jared took another moment to think and then said, "How many decisions have you made today?" "Hundreds, probably. Every action is a decision," Jessica replied. "Exactly," Jared nodded. "So, let's say that you chose to have coffee this morning, but you also could have chosen tea. That decision ripples through your day. It changes your energy levels, your productivity, your thought process. That one decision could change all of your other decisions for that day. For all you know, it could keep rippling out for the rest of your life. The work that you didn't get done today means that you have to make it up tomorrow, and it just keeps going." Jessica was following along now. She understood the basic idea of what he was saying, but it was a lot to wrap her mind around in that particular moment. "And do you know what we call that?" Jared asked her. Jessica shook her head. He smiled and said, "Life." She laughed at this and nodded as she said, "Okay, so what is your temporal philosophy?" "It's the question that stems from all of those decisions," Jared replied. Getting it, Jessica said, "What if?" "Exactly. What if the South won the Civil War? What if America never dropped the bomb on Japan? What if Kennedy never got assassinated?" Jared looked down and said, He pulled us out of Vietnam years earlier. Johnson staged a coup and became the first vice president to be impeached before he was sent to prison. Nixon never resigned because his scandal looked small by comparison, and the economic spiral of the 70s never happened. Reagan never won, the Cold War went on years longer, the Berlin Wall never came down, technology never developed the same way, the US dollar crashed in the 90s, another civil war led to 2 separate unions, Russia became the sole superpower and seized control of Canada. When Jessica didn't respond to anything that Jared just said, he forced a smile and said, "In theory." "So is that what you do? You try to map out the alternate possibilities?" Jessica asked him. "Not exactly," he replied. He was struggling with how to explain himself to her, but there was little that she could do to help him with this. All of those are big global events that change the course of history. I don't concern myself with history or timelines. I look at the people who don't matter to the big picture, whose lives and choices don't make a big impact on the world as a whole, Jared explained. Like you, for example. Wow, Jessica laughed. You just go right for the throat, don't you? Keaton raised his head and looked at Jessica. She waved her hand at him, allowing him to go back to resting peacefully. I didn't mean that the way it sounded, Jared explained. Sorry. It's fine, go on. Jared paused to consider his words again before saying, It's like I was saying about the little decisions rippling out. Someone's life can be changed forever if they didn't meet just the right person at just the right moment. Even if you meet the same person in a different context, the whole relationship could be different. It's the choices themselves that I focus on. What people do and what they would do differently if given the chance. The human element, rather than the historical. Jessica was pretty sure that she was understanding at least some of what Jared was telling her, but she wasn't sure that she got the big picture of it all. Shrugging and shaking his head, Jared stood up and walked toward her Christmas tree, saying, It's hard to explain in words. Rubbing his chin, Jared took a deep breath and tried to think of a way to explain himself. He then looked back at Jessica and said, Do you believe in free will? With a shrug, Jessica replied, Yeah, of course. Because you make the choices that ripple out, Jared nodded. But you never really know how those choices will ripple, do you? You just sort of guess. Jessica thought about that question and then nodded, supposing that Jared was right about that. Raising a finger like the professor character in some old movie, Jared then asked, But can you really have free will if you don't know what the outcome will be? We choose our path, Jessica answered. But you don't choose where that path goes. If you drive down a random road and you end up in Florida, you didn't choose to go to Florida. You just chose the road. I'd probably see the signs for Florida along the way, Jessica told him, challenging his position a little bit. Jared sighed, as though he didn't know what to say next. He clearly had a response to what she'd said, and he almost spoke it aloud, but he stopped himself and shook his head. After taking another sip of his latte and forcing himself to swallow it, Jared took a moment to recenter himself before he moved on. He looked at the multicolored lights that she had strung on the tree and the ornaments that were hanging on each branch. Then his eyes shifted to a bookshelf near her Christmas tree. On the shelf, there was an old ugly figurine of a cat, painted gold with yellow eyes. Jessica had placed it on that shelf with the full knowledge that it was an ugly figurine and nobody else would ever like it. Maybe that's why she did it. After another moment, Jared turned and looked at Jessica. He asked her, What if I told you that you should have been married a long time ago? I'd tell you that you sound like my dead mother. Jared smiled at that response and bobbed his head as though acknowledging the truth of that comment. Then he said, What if I told you that the life you have now isn't the life you had originally, that something had changed? Jessica shrugged, because she didn't know what she was supposed to do with that question. The life you have now, does it feel right to you? Jared asked. I don't have anything to compare it to, Jessica replied. But are there things that you feel you should have had? Love, marriage? Again, Jessica shrugged and said, It sounds nice, but so does $1 million. I should have what I have because my life is what it is. But what if it wasn't what it is? What if I could offer you the ability to take back the life that once belonged to you? A life where you're married to a man you love, and who loves you even more. A life where you die surrounded by family. A log popped in the fireplace, and embers spread across the hearth. Both Jessica and Jared glanced over at it to make sure that nothing was on fire before turning back to their conversation. Sounds nice, I guess, Jessica supposed. Would you want that life? I guess so. But what if having that life meant that you die, surrounded by family, in 1990, not quite yet 30 years old? Jessica grinned and nodded, saying, The catch, because there's always a catch with the monkey's paw wish. With a nod, Jared said, Nobody's life is perfect, so would you still take the deal? Of course not. Who wants to die? We all die whether we want to or not, Jared noted. And in the grand scheme of things, we are all dead for much longer than we ever live. Life is just a blip on the radar of eternity. Jessica raised an eyebrow at the sappiness of that last comment. Even more reason to live as much of it as we can, she said. By what measure? He asked. While this conversation was a fun hypothetical to Jessica, Jared delivered that last question with a serious expression on his face. He really wanted to know the answer. Jessica stopped to think about the scenario that he had established for her. She thought about the things that she had never done with her life and the things that she had. She thought about where she was now and where she still might go. Then she said, "My life is my life." Jared nodded, accepting the answer. He then put his hand on his chin, thinking deeply. "It's all vague hypotheticals," he said. "Exactly," she agreed. With a grin on his face, Jared walked back to where he had been sitting next to the fire and grabbed his bag. He pulled out sheets of blank stationery and set them down on the hearth as he rummaged through the bag, grabbing at stacks of papers that were filled with printed text. As he flipped through the printed pages, the smell of something burning began to fill the room, and Jessica glanced down at the stationery. It was on fire. Jared noticed the fire at the same moment that she did and swatted at the stationery with his hand, pulling it off of the hearth and away from the smoldering ember that he had placed the paper on by mistake. The stationery was burned in one corner, but Jared hardly paid it any attention as he set it back down in a safe spot and continued to rummage through his papers. "You should be careful," Jessica told him. "You don't want to let your thesis on fire, or my house for that matter." Jared laughed at that comment and said, "Sorry about that. I just get distracted." He pulled a sheet of paper from his stack and glanced back at the shelf where the ugly cat figurine was sitting. He then smiled and said, "So, is the vagueness of the question the thing that makes your decision so easy?" Jessica thought for a moment, trying to untangle the question in her head before she said, "No, I don't think so. I mean, you said that I would have died almost 20 years ago in this scenario, so I don't see a tough decision there. Let's reframe the question. It isn't about death, it's about life. Says the guy who isn't the one dying here." Jared chuckled and nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. "I get carried away with my work. I didn't mean to drag you into it." "No, it's interesting," Jessica said. "I'll have you know that I wrote a letter protesting the cancellation of Sliders, twice. The third time I just let it go." "Yeah, but you don't want to be bothered with all of this on Christmas Eve, I'm sure." With a laugh, Jessica said, "I think we've established that I don't have any big plans for the morning. Proceed with your philosophizing, Clarence." A look of puzzlement came over Jared at her last comment. As pop culture references go, this one seemed pretty obvious to Jessica, but she supposed that not everyone was into old black and white Christmas movies. "It's a Wonderful Life," she explained. Jared nodded, though she still wasn't sure that he got the reference. He looked down at his papers and then looked up at Jessica, as though he were about to begin some sort of business proposal in a boardroom meeting. He said, "Fate is fluid." He looked at her as though she should have had some sort of response to this comment, but she didn't have one. The comment meant nothing to her, so she just shook her head and urged him to keep going. "Okay, never mind that one," he said. Then he glanced back at the cat on the shelf and he said, "How about I tell you a story? A story that starts at Christmas time, as a matter of fact." She nodded and settled back in her seat, picking up her now cool mug of hot chocolate and taking a sip, as Jared began his story. The story of you and him, began when you were just a child, but you never knew it back then. You lived in the same town and you went to the same school. For years, you moved around each other, but never with each other. You saw each other in half-forgotten glances, eating lunch in the cafeteria, or walking down the hallway. Maybe you knew of each other in some distant way, but you never really knew each other. So, that's not where I'll begin to tell the story. Where I will begin is in the winter of 1982. You would have been 22 years old at the time. Your family had moved away from your childhood home years earlier, but you still returned to that place every so often to see family and old friends. Part of you still considered that place your home. Maybe part of you still does. On this particular day, you were in town with your mother, who was visiting her sister. The two of them had gone off to lunch to discuss some urgent family business that you weren't involved in, and so you were left to wander the town on your own. You remembered walking those streets as a child, usually holding your mother's hand. You remembered the uneven sidewalks and walking past houses in the summer where people were playing music and working on their old cars. This town wasn't too far from the beach, and you wanted to smell the ocean that day when you came back, but you couldn't. All you could do was walk and smile at the people you passed, who had once been your neighbors. You felt like one of them, even if you had been away for years. You felt as though this was your place, and this was where you belonged, and you loved that feeling. As you walked, you remembered an old candy shop on Main Street where your first grade teacher used to work after school. You remembered going there as a child and seeing giant chocolate eggs at Easter time and Santas at Christmas. You remembered their fudge, and as soon as you thought of it, you knew that you wanted some. So you began to walk toward that shop, just hoping it was still there. You didn't make it all the way to Main Street, though. As you went, you saw the old church where you and your parents used to attend services each Sunday, and you saw the sign out front, inviting people into the rummage sale that they held each December to raise money for the less fortunate. As a child, you would walk through that sale, begging your mother for just about everything you saw, but she usually said no. Your mother never did like a cluttered house, after all. Without even thinking about it, you altered your course, and you walked to the back of the church where they had a large room for community gatherings. They had rows and rows of tables set up and racks of clothes along each wall. You had time on your hands, so you decided to browse and see if anything called out to you, the way it always did when you were a child. Nothing did, really. Oh, there were plenty of useful or beautiful items, but they were all just things. Nothing spoke to you or called out to you, at least not right away. You must have been walking up and down those rows of tables for a half hour, making pleasant conversation with people as you went along. But it wasn't until the very end when you saw the table full of gaudy, ugly old knickknacks that were tucked away in a corner, as though the people running the sale knew that nobody would want those things. You didn't just see ugly knickknacks, though. Somehow your mind began to weave a story around that table, and you imagined the lonely old woman who had once owned all of those things. You imagined a woman who had lived a quiet, isolated life. You imagined that woman collecting trinkets over the course of decades. Each trinket meant something, because there was some long-forgotten story behind them all. Those stories would never be told, however, because the old woman in your made-up story had died alone, in her house of stories. And when she was gone, her trinkets were boxed up and donated to the church. Now people just saw them as ugly old knickknacks. You knew that story was a fabrication of your own mind, but you saw those sad, unwanted items sitting there, and you felt some need to preserve something of that old woman's life. So, you went to that table, and you looked over everything sitting on it, and you found the item that you thought was the most sad and the most unwanted, and you decided to make that trinket your own. You picked it up, and you walked to the table where the man was accepting payment for each item, and you got in line to pay. There were 3 people ahead of you, one woman with a screaming child and an armful of children's clothing, an old man holding a coffee percolator close to his chest, as though it were his now, and nobody would be taking that thing away from him for as long as he lived. And behind that old man, there was another man, a man who was your age, looking around the room as he waited to pay. He turned around, and you both saw what the other was holding at the same time. He saw the cat figurine in your hand, with its gold paint wearing away, and you saw the bright green dog figurine with sad purple eyes. Then you locked eyes with each other, and you started laughing. Even in that moment, there was some small spark in the back of your mind which told you that your world had shifted. You saw his smile, and you thought that this was a smile that you would look at for the rest of your life. It wasn't exactly love at first sight. You weren't married by the next Christmas, but you did pay for your items, and he did end up walking you to that candy shop, which also happened to serve the best cup of hot chocolate in town. Then you went home, but you stayed in touch. He knew some of the same people that you did in town, and he got your phone number from them. He called you, and you'd speak on the phone for hours, talking about everything. His name was Tom, and you thought that it was such a simple, pure name for a man to have. Nothing complicated or trendy. He didn't try to dress it up or be cute by calling himself Thomas or Tommy. He was just Tom, and you found yourself thinking about that name a lot in between phone calls. The 2 of you told yourselves that you were just friends. You lived far apart, and you never got to see each other. The thing was, you both knew that you weren't ever just friends. It was always something more. Time went on, and you eventually came to realize that you'd gone to school together and shared some of the same stories from childhood. You came to believe that the 2 of you were always meant to be in each other's lives. Even when you were separated, you were drawn back together. Your first kiss was on the night of a mutual friend's birthday party. You came back to town, and Tom picked you up at the train station. Tom pointed out the shop that he and his brother wanted to buy someday, a hardware store, and you loved the idea. Something about Tom selling hammers and nails just seemed right to you. He made a joke about your low standards, and you laughed. And he felt this swelling in his chest, a sense of pride in the fact that he'd been the one to make you smile. In that moment, Tom realized that he always wanted to be the one to make you smile. And as soon as he thought it, you saw that thought in his eyes. That was when you kissed. That was when you stopped pretending that there might be some other path or some different outcome. From that second forward, the two of you were one team, two halves of a whole. You were the couple that all of the miserable people hated because you made it look too easy. It wasn't exactly simple, though. Both of you were strong-minded and stubborn. When you did find yourselves in disagreement, you'd fight and bicker. But you always did it in that way that only comes from knowing that you were still on the same side at the end of the day. You never even thought of breaking up, even if you might have considered killing each other on one or two occasions. You were married in the fall of 1985, right here on your parents' land, up on that hill that overlooks the entire property. It was a small wedding, and you didn't have a big reception. If you could have just pledged yourselves to each other on your own, you would have, but your mother wanted to see her girl get married. Both of your families celebrated that night, cooking food over an open fire and dancing to music that was being played over a car radio. You laughed and sang old songs with your father, and you watched Tom ruin his suit when he raced his brother by the river and fell in the mud. If that land on that night were all that existed in the world, you would have been happy for the rest of your life. The years went on, and life went on. Tom and his brother saved up enough money to buy their hardware store, just barely. You started teaching second grade in the same school that you and Tom had gone to. Life was quiet and mundane, but you never took it for granted. It was stressful at times, especially when Tom was just starting out at the store. It could be overwhelming. But then one of you would catch the other's eye, and you could melt the world away with a gaze. He once said that the sight of you reminded him to breathe. Life wasn't perfect, no life is, but your life together was the best that either of you ever hoped for. When things changed, it didn't sink in for either of you right away. You were tired and sick, but the word cancer just didn't make sense when the doctors spoke it. At first, it seemed as though the world were pulsating around you both, and neither one of you knew what to do with this new situation. You were enveloped by that word and what it meant, but at the same time, life went on. It was strange at times, how normal life could be. You still woke up and ate food and laughed and watched bad TV shows on the couch. You were sick, but you didn't always feel sick. There were days when you still felt like the luckiest woman on the planet. On the other days, when you couldn't bring yourself to get out of bed, he would be there. He would sit on the floor by the bed sometimes, because he didn't want to risk waking you up by climbing in beside you. And he'd watch you sleep. He would study every curve of your face and the sound of your breathing. He would try to force his brain to remember every scent and every strand of hair, because in those moments he was terrified. The thought of you not being there made him feel as if he were drowning deep in the ocean, and he couldn't find his way back to the surface. For a time, it seemed as if you were getting better. The two of you celebrated and smiled and held each other, but even in those moments, there was a darkness inside of you. Maybe you knew that your cancer wasn't truly gone, or maybe you were just unable to shake the awareness of your own mortality. The idea that your life could end and the two of you could be separated changed both of you. Tom didn't go a night without waking up to make sure that you were still breathing. You didn't go a day without wondering if every cough and hiccup meant that it was back. In the dark, as you were settling in for the night, you'd both hold on to each other, as if trying to capture each second and preserve it for eternity. You made plans in the dark, plans to turn the room down the hall into a nursery. Tom would even bring home paint and supplies from the store, and you'd sit in there when he wasn't home, testing samples on the wall and imagining the child sleeping in a crib. The life ahead, first day of school, summer vacations, Christmases, and birthday parties. But it never felt real, no matter how much you wanted it. Deep down, you knew that it would never happen. So you clung to Tom, and he held on to you. You had whispered conversations about how scared you both were, and those conversations eventually led into your giving him permission to move on when you were gone. You wanted him to be happy, and saying as much just made him more sad. Tom was with you when the doctor told you that your condition had worsened, and you both cried. He was with you when you were throwing up and sleeping for most of the day. He was with you when you were in pain, and he wished more than anything that he could take that pain from you. He was with you when he realized that The only way that your suffering would end was when you died, and that moment broke him in a way that he would never be able to fix. It was the moment when being together forever wasn't what was best. It was the moment when he knew that he'd have to make it okay for you to go. You fought a noble battle, Jessica. You were a warrior, and you clawed your way through that battle because you were fighting for the thing you held most dear. You couldn't stand the thought of hurting him. In the end, as you gasped and fought and struggled against the medication trying to stay awake, Tom held you close and whispered in your ear, letting you know that it was okay to be finished. He told you that it wasn't giving up to go. You found each other, and you'd loved each other, and you'd made your life together. Your eyes were already closed despite your best efforts when he gave you a kiss on the forehead, the last kiss, which he couldn't allow to be the last, so he kissed you again and again. But you were gone, and the last kiss was already behind him. And life went on. At first, Tom couldn't force himself to pretend that he cared about any of it. He didn't care about the funeral or the casseroles in the fridge. He wanted to lock himself away in the house that you'd made your world in until he died himself. Maybe he would have died there, but both of your families refused to allow it. Your parents told him to get out there and live because you would hate to be the thing that took him down. And he had to pretend to agree because he couldn't hurt them. His parents told him how much they loved him and how much they loved you and how they would get through the pain together. And he had to pretend to agree because he couldn't hurt them either. His brother and sister-in-law would come over to the house with their baby, and they'd force him to eat and hold conversations. His brother would cover for him at the store, but then force him to stay up to date on the business, and Tom would have to pretend to care because he couldn't hurt them. Your nephew Bailey was only 2 years old when you died. He had no idea what was going on around him or why his uncle was so sad. He was just a ball of energy who would force Tom to pay him attention, whether Tom wanted to or not. Bailey was the first one to make Tom smile a real smile after you died. He was the first one to make Tom think about tomorrow, or next year, or 10 years from now. That kid, who was the person who tried the least to make things okay for Tom, was the one who brought Tom back to the surface. Tom was back in the world and living in the world. He loved and smiled and joked and cared, but he never moved on from you. Even as he took part in the lives of the people around him, you were with him. You haunted him, and he never wanted you to stop. He would keep notebooks nearby, and every time a memory of you flashed through his mind, he would write it down, no matter how small or mundane. He wanted to preserve you forever. He never wanted to let you go. When I approached Tom and told him about my work, he thought I was crazy. He didn't believe in what I was doing, and he didn't believe me when I told him that I could bring you back. He didn't believe me when I told him that a fluke of nature was what caused your cancer, a random reaction your body had to Tom himself, and all that I would need to do in order for you to live was prevent your ever meeting him. He didn't believe it, but it was all he had to hold on to, and the thought of not taking that chance, no matter how impossible it was simply not an option. Tom couldn't stand the thought of losing the life that you had together, but he also couldn't stand the thought of your being dead. He knew that if you'd never met, he would never have the one thing that he loved the most in the world, but he also knew that any world with you in it was a better world than one without you. Tom may not have sacrificed his life for you, but he did sacrifice his world. So, here we are. As Jared finished telling this story, Jessica was watching him with narrowed eyes and a smile on her face. Keaton was sleeping by her side, and she had one hand on his belly. She could feel him breathing, and the slight twitch of his muscles as he chased rabbits in his dreams. Once he was done, Jared put his papers back into his bag and took a bite from another cookie as he watched her, waiting for her to say something. "You're very good at telling stories," Jessica told him. "I like that." "It wasn't just a story, it was your story," he replied. "Not my story. My story has a lot more stupid cable shows and bottles of wine." Jared accepted that response with a nod and a shrug. "The funny part is, you weren't that far off with the beginning. The part where I got that cat at the rummage sale? That is actually where I bought the thing. However, I did not meet my soulmate there, I assure you." Jared smiled and said, Only because you bumped into another man who asked you if you knew where the bathroom was. Jessica's smile dropped just a little bit. She hadn't thought about that day in many years, but she did remember it, and there was a man who asked her where the bathroom was. Just enough of a delay to allow one more woman to slip into the line ahead of you, he told her. How did you know that? She asked. Jared smiled again and said, Maybe I am just good at making up stories. Or maybe I was that man. Maybe this was how I gave Tom what he wanted, a world with you in it. You probably weren't even born in 1982, she replied. Jared laughed at that and said, I was not. Silence fell between the two of them as Jessica allowed this story to sink in and the implications of what it meant. For his part, Jared didn't push her into more conversation. He turned to look into the fire, watching it burn. After some time, Jessica shook off the insanity of the story and forced a smile once again as she said, This is what you do, right? Your philosophical studies are all about the roads not taken. Taken, not taken, Jared shrugged. Taken again and not. The world's been spinning in circles for as long as it's existed. It's interesting to think about, Jessica allowed. She was trying her best to ignore the sick feeling in her gut, which came from his oddly accurate retelling of that day so many years ago. She was trying to look at this as a thought exercise and nothing more, but it felt wrong to her. Jessica glanced toward the stairs and then back to Jared as she said, I thought I heard the deputy upstairs. Jared smiled politely. He didn't appear to believe the lie, so if he were a serial killer, an imaginary deputy wasn't going to stop him. So, if I look up this Tom guy now, she asked, to which Jared replied, You would find a man who has lived a life without you. His store opened and it closed. His brother took a job in the city, and Tom went to work for one of the big chain stores that put him out of business. Did he ever get married? No, Jared replied. He's been dating the same woman for 13 years now, but she never wanted marriage, never even wanted to live together. So, he lives in a house by himself, and he's fine with that. He lives his life at arm's length. Is he happy? Upon hearing this question, Jared took a deep breath and then said, Happiness is relative, I suppose. And what about the Tom who did marry this imaginary me? She died in 1990, so where would he be now? Never remarried, if that's what you mean. His life did go on, though, ups and downs, like anyone. He took a somewhat different path than his other self. Was he happy? Jared shrugged and said, He had a different scale, to say the least, but I think he was okay overall, after some time. Jessica nodded and said, I like your story. It reminds me of those old books where you get to choose your own outcome. And now that you know the outcome, you truly have free will, he told her. What do you mean? You decide which path you take. You can choose the longer life, here, alone. Or you can choose the other. You mean I can choose to die? Thanks, but I'll take the option where I live to a ripe old age. Jared smiled a wide smile and said, Don't answer the question yet. Think about it. Spend some time with it. And when you do make your final decision... Jared trailed off, looking around the room. He then stood up and walked to Jessica's Christmas tree and removed one of the ornaments which was hanging on it. He went to Jessica and handed her the ornament. It was an antique silver bell which had belonged to her grandparents. When you decide, just ring that bell, he said. Then he yawned. You should get some sleep, Jessica told him. In the morning I'll make breakfast, and you can tell me stories about how friendless and unloved I am. Jared smiled at her joke. He went to the spot where he was sitting and grabbed his bag from the floor. Good night, he said to her. Good night, she replied. As Jared walked toward the stairs, a thought popped into Jessica's mind, and she said, Hey. Jared turned around. It's Christmas Eve, Jessica said, standing up. Every guest gets a gift from under the tree, and a picture with your host by the fire. She walked to the tree and bent down, grabbing one wrapped present from a stack of gifts that all looked more or less the same. When she came up with this plan, she'd imagined the room filled with people gathering around on Christmas Eve. She pictured children excitedly unwrapping packages, and adults pleasantly surprised. She'd always liked watching people open presents, but it had been a while since she'd had the chance. Now it seemed as if Jared would be her one and only recipient. Jessica handed Jared the gift and said, You can wait to open it in the morning if you want, or you can open it now. Your choice. Jared took the gift with a look of surprised gratitude. I haven't gotten one of these in a while, he said. Thank you. Jessica raised an eyebrow and nodded toward the package. With a big smile, Jared opened the present. It was nothing fancy, just a scarf that Jessica had knitted, one of 1,000 scarves that she'd made over the years, when she had too much free time on her hands. Jared laughed and said, I could have used this earlier. It's great, thank you. Merry Christmas, Jessica replied. Now the picture, I'll get my camera. Jared looked toward the fireplace and then said, It's a little dark for pictures. Maybe in the morning? Jessica agreed with a nod. Jared was still smiling as he wrapped the scarf around his neck and walked up the stairs. Watching him go, Jessica felt the joy of giving a Christmas present for the first time in a long time. It wasn't exactly what she'd pictured when she made those gifts, but it felt good. It was nice to have someone there on Christmas Eve, even if he was strange and a little creepy. It was nice to not be alone. Jessica didn't know what time it was, but it must have been late. The fire was dying down, and the glow of the Christmas tree was what now provided most of her light. The darkness outside kept her from seeing whether or not it was still snowing. Her windows were pure black, aside from the reflections of the room in which she stood. She looked at those reflections, her other self standing in her other house, and her mind went back to the story that Jared had told her. What if? A smile formed on her lips as she thought of the possibility, and she began to think about the question that Jared had asked her. Sitting back down beside Keaton, Jessica stroked the dog's fur. He snuggled in close to her as she did this, and then fell back to sleep. Her house was quiet, aside from the sound of her dog's breathing and the occasional pop or crackle in the fireplace. Under her tree, there were boxes filled with presents for nobody, presents which she would probably end up donating to charity. What would that other life be like? She didn't believe that what Jared told her was any form of the truth, but it was still an interesting question to ponder. And so she did ponder it, as she sat there, watching her fire slowly die as the night grew later. While people all over the world were already asleep, looking forward to Christmas with the ones they loved, Jessica was sitting in mostly silence as her best friend chased rabbits in his dreams. Jessica lived alone now, just as she had always been. She might find someone and get married, or she might not. Kids were probably off the table at this point in her life. Despite all of the ifs and maybes, this moment appeared to be all that her life would ever be. She ran a successful business. She was respected by the people in her community. She had people that she cared about, but nobody that she would consider very close. How did Jared describe the life of her supposed love interest now? Life at arm's length. Maybe she really did have something in common with this guy. Despite her best efforts to change the look and feel of the house in which she lived, there were times when Jessica couldn't help but feel the presence of her parents. They'd always been there for her. They'd always guided her and comforted her. As she sat in that room, she thought back to their first Christmas in that house. It was just the three of them that year, a small, quiet Christmas. It was a beautiful Christmas, however. They built a snowman and sang along to silly old Christmas cartoons. She felt their absence a lot at times. In those moments, the house became somehow more empty and more quiet. Was this how she had imagined her life? No. She'd always pictured herself growing old surrounded by people who loved her. Even in Jared's version of her life, that wouldn't be an option. That version of herself wouldn't grow old at all. But then again, she would be surrounded by people who loved her. She would be a part of something bigger than herself. It was an interesting question, which wasn't as easily dismissed once she really stopped to think about it. While her first instinct was to tell Jared that she'd choose the longer life, now there was a fragment of a quote from some old movie playing on a loop in her head. She didn't remember it exactly, but the quote said something about not having spent much time together, but loving a lifetime's worth. The fact that she couldn't place where that line came from might have driven her insane if she'd allowed it to. As it was, she tried her best to move on. It was a stupid hypothetical question anyway. Her life was what it was, and there was no way of changing that, even if she wanted to. She hadn't even realized that she was still holding the old silver bell ornament in her hand until she looked down at it. Shaking her head at the notion of what Jared had proposed, Jessica put the bell down on a nearby table, and she picked herself back up off the ground, being careful not to wake Keaton. Silly questions served no purpose, and despite any regrets that she might have, life went on. She picked up her mug, and the one that had once been filled with Jared's pumpkin spice latte. Then she bent down to grab the plate that still had one cookie sitting on it, and that's when something beside the fireplace caught her eye. A small notebook. It must have fallen out of Jared's bag when he went searching through his papers, and Jessica didn't want him to forget the notebook when he left because it might be important to his work. So she put her dishes down, and she picked the notebook up. As she held it in her hands, she flipped through the thing, not paying attention to the words that were scribbled inside at first. But then one line caught her eye. She leaned against the kitchen counter, pressing her coffee mug to her lips. Not sipping, just feeling the warmth of it. Jessica smiled as she read that line, because she also had a habit of pressing coffee mugs to her lips. Then there was another line, bobbing her head to the sound of imaginary music as she grated papers. And another, picking a fight with me over the fact that I voted for Dole in the primaries. That line made Jessica scrunch up her face as she read it. This book was full of lines such as those, little details which Jared must have used to flesh out his hypothetical timelines for people as part of his research. She read on. She would pour milk on her Fruit Loops and wait for them to get soggy before she ate them. That one made Jessica smile. This imaginary girl sounded pretty cool to her. We stood there, not really kissing any longer, just lips pressed against lips, holding each other in that moment for as long as we could. Jess tried to make her mother's lemon cake and dropped the pan on the ground. Batter splashed everywhere. Her hands smelled like lemons all night. Seeing her name, or a version of her name, on the page made Jessica pause for a moment. This book wasn't just filled with random lines for random people. It was all for her, which made Jared seem even more creepy. She flipped through page after page of stupid little comments about a version of her who never existed, and she wasn't sure what to do with any of it. Should she call the police? Should she tell Keaton to attack? All of her internal alarms were going off, but something kept Jessica's eyes on that notebook, filled with scribbled lines, written by different colored pens at different times. Some of the writing looked slow and purposeful. Other notes looked as if they'd been written in a frenzy. The last note in the book read, "The papier-mâché elephant from Noah's Ark fell apart and tripped Steve Jansen. Jess tripped over him and took the Ark down with her. Best Christmas show ever." When she read that last line, Jessica stopped and stared at the words on the page. Her mouth was hanging open as she read it, because even if Jared were stalking her, there was no way that he could have known about something like that. It's not like the production was written up in the town newspaper. She closed her eyes and tried to think back to all of the kids in her school who would have been in that Christmas show. She was trying to remember if any of them were named Tom. Then again, of course there was a Tom. Every school had a Tom or a Tommy. She probably went to school with a dozen of them. She felt strange as she stood there in her own house, alone in a room that was protected by her lovable but fierce guard dog. It felt as if someone were standing behind her, whispering in her ear, trying to get her attention. Except there were no whispers. She was still alone. Flipping to the front of the notebook, Jessica began to read again. This time she read through the book more slowly. Page after page was filled with little fragments of memories. There was no overarching story to go with it. There was no suspense or drama. Most of them were stupid things, and she had no idea why anyone would want to remember them. Then she thought of Tom, the Tom who had lost his wife, the one who was desperate to hold on to someone that was gone forever. He'd never hear her voice again, or smell her hands after a lemon cake mishap. In that context, the notebook wasn't creepy or scary. It was sad. Her heart broke for this man whom she had never known. For all she knew, he didn't even exist. Except he felt like he existed, there, on those pages. He felt as if he were calling to the ghost of the woman he loved, to Jessica. That thought was weird and creepy. Jessica tried to stop herself from going down that path because even if he were a real person, she couldn't have possibly been his Jessica. Fruit Loops were clearly better when soggy, and everyone knew that. Plenty of people probably pressed warm mugs to their lips without even realizing it. It wasn't her, and it couldn't be her. Her fingers ran over the scribbled words on one of those pages, and she could almost feel Tom's emotions as he wrote them, the loss and desperation. As the night went on and morning approached, Jessica couldn't bring herself to put that notebook down. She just held it in her hands, thinking about the man who had written the words. Like anyone else, she had spent quiet hours of the night wondering what her life would be like if things had gone differently. What would her imaginary husband be like? What would their imaginary kids be like? Whenever she thought about the road not taken, she felt a sadness in her heart. She had a great life by all measures. She was thankful for what she'd been able to accomplish and for the family that she'd been given. But what if? What must Tom have felt like writing in this notebook of his? Jessica could picture the life that Tom had once had based on what Jared had told her and the little details that Tom chose to write down. What would it be like to lose someone whom you had loved so much? Jessica wouldn't know. She'd never loved or been loved in such a way. She could only imagine and wish and pray. She felt that sadness in her heart again, but it wasn't for some blurry image in her mind. It was for the man who had written down those memories. The man who, according to Jared, had sacrificed everything that he had ever had and everything that he had ever loved because he didn't want to live in a world without her. She imagined loving someone so much that you would sacrifice it all for that person. She imagined being that person who was loved in such a way. That was what she'd always dreamed of in the late hours of the night, when she was alone with her thoughts. That was the life she'd always wanted, the man she'd always wanted. But, hypothetically, she already had those things. She'd already lived that life and knew those feelings, but they were taken from her. This hypothetical husband of hers had taken it upon himself to make that decision. It was insane, but as she pondered the scenario, she found herself feeling just a little bit angry at this idea. Jessica's mind was racing with images and possibilities, and while she wasn't sure that she actually believed in Jared's offer of setting her on a different path, she did know one thing. If Tom had loved his wife so much that he was willing to sacrifice his world for her, Jessica would have had to have loved him just as much. She would have wanted to fight for what they'd had, no matter how it ended, because a world with them in it together had to be better than a world without them. What if? She looked toward the old silver bell that was sitting on the table, and then closed her eyes, remembering the part of Jared's story where Tom couldn't stand for their last kiss to be the last kiss. What if? The question rang through her mind once again. What if?
This is the voice of the embers, where stories burn.